common question that we get asked here at Quelfire is in relation to fire stopping of steel beams where they penetrate compartment lines. So a challenging application. So first and foremost, structural steel beams that are supporting the structure. So supporting perhaps a profile deck floor being a common application where you've got a metal deck with concrete that is typically supported on structural steelwork, also supporting roofs at the sides of buildings and so on. That steelwork is structural, is part of the building, and first and foremost that steel needs to be protected itself. Protection of steelwork is usually accomplished using things like inch-messing coatings or board encasement systems, and those systems are fire tested to ensure that the steel maintains its structural integrity during a fire for the period of fire resistance required. So for that test, the steel beams are subjected to load intended to replicate the loading that they would be under in a building situation in the event of a fire, and what is then being tested is obviously the coating or the steel protection's ability to insulate and protect that steel for the period of fire resistance required. So those things like the coatings, the boarding systems, first and foremost, that is the protection system for the steel itself. The situation we're talking about here is then where those steels penetrate a compartment line. Usually a wall, maybe a floor situation, but commonly a wall where, particularly in the instance I mentioned earlier of supporting a steel profile deck floor, they are going to be positioned directly underneath that floor. So when a wall is then installed to the underside of that floor, dividing the building up on each floor level, there is a possibility that that steel could then penetrate that wall, so pass through that wall with the wall formed around it, an opening formed around the steel. The challenge then comes in that any gap or penetration in the wall construction needs to be suitably fire stopped to ensure that the wall maintains its period of fire resistance. The problem with steel beams is that there is no test standard for testing steel beam penetrations. As I've mentioned, there's a test standard for testing fire protection to the steel itself, but that's protecting the steel along its length. It's not intended for compartmentation purposes. So the question we get asked is, how can we fire stop around this beam penetration where it's passing through the wall? Now, the challenge with that is there is no standard, as I mentioned, there's no harmonised standard between the protection of the beam and the penetration situation. It's not simply a case of just filling the gap around the beam. That beam is going to be deflecting and moving in the event of a fire. The loading element is a massive part of how the steel protection is tested. So when it comes to fire stopping it as a penetration, there's no crossover between the penetration standard and that beam protection standard. It's not possible to test the situation and then get extended scope for things like different beam sizes, different substrate constructions and so on. So any testing that is done of a material fire stopping around a steel beam where it penetrates a compartment line is completely ad hoc. What that means is ad hoc test evidence is what you test is the situation that's covered down to the exact information that is included in the test: the steel beam size, steel thickness, encasement around the beam, opening size, specific substrate, configuration of everything together is just exactly what's tested. It cannot be extended to cover real life site applications. So is very challenging. There isn't a lot of test evidence on the market. At Quelfire we do have some primary test evidence, but it is ad hoc, as I've just mentioned, so it has those limitations. So usually it needs to be reviewed by a qualified independent fire engineer, someone who can review the project specific application, look at the substrate, look at the beam and the protection that's around the beam, and then review our test evidence and either confirm or make suggestions as to how it might apply to the project application. We do have a technical guidance note at Quelfire with the information of what we've tested and outlining this issue. We've also got a knowledge hub piece on this as well, so you can read that for more details. But that technical guidance note is there. It has everything there to be passed to the fire engineer. What we have tested is completely uncoated and unprotected steelwork. A couple of different types of steelwork, as well as an encased steel. One big challenge when it comes to steelwork penetrating compartment lines is if the steelwork is coated with an inch-messing coating. There will be potentially concerns around compatibility if you're installing any anything like a sealant or a wet product up against that intrumescent coating. We have known it in the past where compatibility issues have arisen in that regard. You've also got the element of the intrumescent coating on the steel beam needing space to react and expand to do its job in terms of protecting the steel, ensuring its structural stability. So if you've then got something like a fire bat or a Firestop seal installed directly against that coating, that's also going to impact that element of the coating's job. So generally that is not a compatible arrangement. If steelwork is penetrating a compartment line, it would need to be encased with a boarding system, and even then it would need to be reviewed by a qualified fire engineer in relation to the project application to ensure that it can be fire stopped and they're happy with the configuration. So quite a challenging application, not something that there's a standard tested detail for. There's no standard details available for that sort of application. Word of advice is early engagement at the design stage of the building. Ideally, avoid having steels passing through compartment lines or interacting with compartment lines in any way. If that can be done, ideal, you avoid a lot of issues. If not, obviously we do have that ad hoc test data. Reach out to us, we're happy to provide it. It will need to be reviewed by a qualified fire engineer, so you'll need to make sure you've got a fire engineer involved in the project. But obviously we're happy to help and support with that as much as we can. So please reach out if you've got questions, technical@quelfire.co.uk, and obviously make sure you're following us on all of our social media channels.